Hello and welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Shaun Ley. So much smoke has been generated by Australia's bushfires, it's created a plume the size of the continental United States. NASA tracked it as it circumnavigated the globe. Drought and record temperatures have created a giant tinderbox. Yet Australia's government insists it's too simplistic to blame climate change. Patrick Suckling spent 3 years as Australia's ambassador for the environment. He believes the threat is all too real. But with politicians and voters still committed to exporting massive quantities of coal, was he just wasting his time? Patrick Suckling in Sydney, welcome to Hard Talk. Just as some countries have a rainy season, some have a hurricane season, Australia has a bushfire season. But how different would you say this one has been?
This one's been the worst we've had in New South Wales, certainly. So it's been unprecedented. It's been horrific, it's been tragic, it's been a summer of hell. I would say, though, up front, taking the opportunity with all your viewers around the world to say how heartened we've all been by the extraordinary response and support we've had around the world for this tragic time. So thank you to all your viewers and those around the world who've supported us at this time of trouble.
The government says that while the threat to life remains, it wants to focus on containing the fires and protecting lives. On that metric, how do you think it's done?
The fires have been unprecedented, they've been shocking, they've been all over Australia, there have been hundreds of them burning at the same time. Normally the fire season will see fires going from north to south. This time the fires have been everywhere at once. So it's been an extraordinary job done at the Commonwealth level, but by state governments as well, but most importantly by the fire services on the ground who've worked night and day, week in, week out, month in, month out to do as best they can to contain these fires and protect lives. So we've lost over 5,500 buildings, we've lost 2,600 homes. Tragically, we've lost 34 lives, but for those heroic, valiant and constant efforts, we would have lost a whole lot more. So the response has been, by and large, given the magnitude of the fires, very impressive, and we've seen that in the accommodations and the support and the positive feedback that we've received around the world for how we as Australia and how our communities have handled this extraordinary situation.
There is a question of leadership, though, here, isn't there? And some have argued that the government has got so caught up in this debate about climate change that it hasn't engaged with the people who would have given it the best possible advice. Let me put you what Greg Mullins, who used to lead the Fire and Rescue Service in New South Wales, the state you're in at the moment, said. He says he's been trying to get a meeting with the government since April of last year because we knew, he says, it was going to be a horror fire season. It's very, very disappointing we weren't listened to earlier. Measures could have been taken months ago to make the firefighters more effective and to make the community safer. That's the first job of government, isn't it? To make people safe. On that basis, hasn't it let them down?
It is, and the government takes its advice from all sorts of places, and it was briefed about the unprecedented threat of big bushfires this season, and so it happened, and it was as bad and as worse as we could have thought. The Prime Minister has said in retrospect he thinks he could have done some things better. Perhaps listening to them might have been one of them, but certainly there's been a significant and dramatic and sustained effort, including through our Defence Forces, to deal with this unprecedented bushfire season.
A comparison has been drawn by the Australian Ethics Centre with how governments prepare for the risk, the potential of a terrorist act. They said at the start of this year they wouldn't wait until there was unanimity in the advice they received. They would accept the consensus view. And we know now that we have seen a consensus view developing in science about climate change, the consensus view of those presenting the intelligence, and they take preventative action. So why, the Centre asks of our political leaders, ignored the warnings of fire chiefs, defence analysts and climate scientists and played Russian roulette with our future?
I think there was a high degree of preparedness, as there always is for Australian bushfire seasons. I mean, don't forget, we've had bushfires for decade in, decade out for the whole of human settlement in Australia. And as you know, that goes back 60,000 years with our Indigenous people. So there's a high degree of knowledge, awareness and preparation that goes into bushfire season. I think the thing that happened with this season, it was unprecedented. There was an extended drought, so things were very dry. There were all sorts of exacerbating factors like the Indian Ocean El Nino, the hot winds coming in from the stratosphere from Antarctica, and of course the underlying cause of climate change making things hotter and dry, which does mean that Australia will have worse fires as we go forward unless we address the challenge of climate change. So I think a lot of that was understood, but the magnitude of this fire when it came was such that even despite significant preparations, including a lot of backburning in all sorts of different areas and control of vegetation, they were, as you saw, unmanageable in many parts of Australia.
Understood, but perhaps not acted upon. I mean, the then Australian government back in 2008 commissioned the Drought climate change report, in which Professor Drought wrote, projections suggest that fire seasons will start earlier and end slightly later, as this one has had, and generally be more intense. Governments of all political colours were warned that the scale of this problem was going to increase. And arguably, for a lot of Australians, they don't seem to have prepared adequately for that.
You're right. Those predictions have been around, well, since the 60s and the 70s. The Drought report did make that observation. The IPCC of the UN makes those sorts of observations as well. So that has fed into the thinking around preparedness and actions around bushfire season for Australia. So it's not to say that Australia hasn't done anything. And as I say, but for the extraordinary efforts of an extraordinary number of people, volunteers, firefighters, Australian defence personnel, communities, the devastation would have been much, much worse.
You're a former diplomat. You've been quite diplomatic about what you've said so far, which is perfectly understandable. But the man who appointed you to your job as Australia Ambassador for the Environment, Malcolm Turnbull, who was Mr Morrison's predecessor as Prime Minister, has been rather more blunt. He says, rather than doing what a leader should do, Scott Morrison downplayed the threat, at times discounted the influence of climate change, which is just nonsense from a scientific point of view. He says, so that has misled people. Do you share that criticism?
I think you've heard the Prime Minister himself say, as I said earlier, that in retrospect he could have done
sure, but I want to know what you think.
A little bit better. And I think in that context, climate change and recognising climate change and accepting and messaging on climate change to the communities about the risks and Australia's contribution to the climate change effort around the world is an important factor. But as you know, that's a longer term factor. I mean, at the moment we had these fires upon us, irrespective of whatever else was happening in relation to mitigation around the world. And in that context, although slow out of the blocks by his own admission, there was an extraordinary effort by all levels of government and all levels of community to deal with the fires.
Let me pick up on that phrase, slow out of the blocks, because this is a mounting criticism of Australia's attitude to the potential threat of climate change. And it comes in various forms. On the one hand, and we'll perhaps talk a little bit about this in due course, the politics of Australia, the dependence on minerals, the fact that the voters just in this last election went for a government that said climate change is not actually the key thing we have to worry about. We have to balance the needs of the economy against the environment, and rejected a party, Labour, that seemed to be edging towards more restrictions. And a target that Australian governments have set, which is that by 2030 Australia should decrease its emissions by 26% compared to 2005, a target that most observers, including the United Nations, now think won't be met. Putting all of that together, isn't Australia not so much leading as reluctantly following and trying to restrain other countries from doing more?
Australia is not leading on climate, that's fair to say, but Australia is playing its part. That target that you've just mentioned, the 26 to 28% target by 2030, that represents a halving of emissions per person in Australia, or a two-thirds reduction per unit of GDP. That's not insignificant.
Yes, but if it's
not
met,
to say that Australia
and the UN says it's not going to be met.
Well, that's the UN's view. The abatement coming out of the Australian economy year on year suggests we will meet that target. The figures I've seen, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that they've kept on increasing. I think in the year to March 2019, a 0.6% jump on the previous year. Yeah, the projections do show that emissions are continuing to increase, although the last projections there was a slight fall in them. But given the policy measures that are in place in the Australian economy, given the extraordinary uptake of renewables in the Australian economy, per capita we're the highest in the world now, 1 in 5 households has solar energy, there are all sorts of things that are beginning to impact on emissions growth, and you'll, I think, see a reduction. And as the Prime Minister, I think one of the more noticeable newsworthy things coming out of these fires on a climate change perspective is the Prime Minister saying that he is prepared to look at doing more, to look at different policies, new policies, whether it's mitigation, whether it's adaptation and resilience, and that's a very significant comment from him.
The Climate Change Performance Index, which is published, as you'll know, by Germanwatch, the international think tank, in which the latest one came out in December, describes, I mean, apart from ranking Australia as 56th and under the bottom 5 performers in terms of how it meets its climate emission reduction target and its overall mitigation strategy, it says experts note the new government is an increasingly regressive force in negotiations. You were involved in some of those negotiations during your time as the ambassador. Did you find yourself restrained by the domestic politics, by, frankly, the internal divisions in this government, which were reflected in previous governments too?
You know, I wasn't restrained as Ambassador for the Environment for Australia in terms of prosecuting our interests internationally. You know, when we signed up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, the target that we selected was comparable with Canada, New Zealand, Japan, the United States. We were in good company. So the comment that I got when I was ambassador was Australia's back, including our climate finance commitments to developing countries are not insignificant, including an enormous amount going to the Pacific region.
Although you are actually, we're told the government has made its final payment to the fund that helps the Global Action Fund, which was developed by the United Nations. According to Climate Change News, the GCF has co-financing capabilities and regional coverage Australia couldn't possibly provide on its own. And yet the Australian government has decided it isn't paying any more into that fund. Is that, in terms of international leadership, the right signal for the government to be sending?
Just on that fund, we co-chaired it for the first 3 years, and it was a nightmare. It was a very difficult fund. It was very political. It was quite an incompetent fund. And so the Prime Minister's view was he'd prefer to spend Australia's money directly with a greater impact on the ground in areas that we could control. So at the same time as he announced that Australia wouldn't replenish that fund, he announced a $2 billion infrastructure fund for the Pacific, all of which investments would be put through a climate prism, and subsequently announced another $500 million, including an additional $120 million to leverage $800 million worth of private sector money, which is exactly the sort of financing you want to see for climate change. So on that fund in particular, don't take the criticism. But in terms of could Australia being...
Sorry to interrupt you, just to clarify that. In some circumstances to do with climate change, it is better to act alone.
It's better to do things in a whole myriad of ways. We contribute to all sorts of multilateral funds, but we also do things bilaterally. And in this case, in relation to that particular fund at that particular time, it's since had some governance improvements, which we're hearing makes that fund a lot more effective. But at the time the decision was made, the fund was not working particularly well, and the Prime Minister's view was that it would be better to spend Australia's money directly in areas of most need, which we could control.
You yourself, in an article that was published just before Christmas, said that many developing countries are in parts of the world that will be more affected by climate change. As they don't have the resources, we need to step in and help them, which is clearly what you think the government is doing with its investment in the Pacific region. I just wonder why the other Pacific nations, some of them are most directly affected, don't see it that way. Can I quote you, Enele Epesobawaga, the former Prime Minister of Tuvalu, and forgive me if I've mispronounced his name, who chaired last year's Pacific Island Forum. He says he was stunned by the un-Pacific tenor and manner of Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, who was, in his words, trying to water down the wording of the communique, their agreement on acting against climate change. They wanted really strong action, and the Australian Prime Minister was sitting there going, no, not going to sign that.
Yeah, there's always different perspectives. I mean, you know, what Australia was doing in that context was taking out some things from that communique which were just unrealistic and untenable.
So basically no references to coal and trying to end reliance on that kind of thing, which is responsible for many of these emissions, as you would accept, wouldn't you?
Well, saying there should be no new coal-fired power stations by 2020, which is now, that's just patently unrealistic. So if you want to have credibility internationally, it's good to put out a statement that has credibility. That was our fundamental point.
Do you think Australia has credibility internationally?
Well, that communique the PM signed up to is the most ambitious communique on climate change that any Australian government has ever signed. So
it's
in that
not
sense,
saying much, is it, given Australia's political record, whether under the Labour governments where they couldn't agree and in the end put their policy on ice because they were squabbling over it, or indeed under this coalition, Liberal National Coalition, which has apparently the same problem. Is that because of the voters or because of the politicians?
I think what you see on climate change in Australia is similar to what you see in many parts of the world, which is we're on a journey. So Australia has taken action. It is taking action. It does need to do more. I'm not contesting that. As you say, I've written that. The Australian, many straight people in Australia, when they're regularly polled, a vast majority of Australians say they want to see stronger action on climate change. And if they have to pay for it, they don't mind doing that either. So there's a growing consensus in Australia, which I think is shrinking down the view that the climate denialists that are among us, as they are in most societies or every society. But year on year, decade on decade, Australia's action on climate change has been increasing, and I'm absolutely confident it will continue to increase. And as I say, I think one of the big news stories out of these tragic fires is the PM's being very clear that climate change is a factor, and being very clear that he's prepared to have a look at a whole range of different policies and solutions in relation to climate change.
Let's talk about
so that's progress, that's positive.
Let's talk about then the economic issue here. At the heart of it, Australia's economy is built on natural resources. Sure, its environment is a magnet for tourists, but coal's been the second largest export. Certainly in recent years, the industry provides around 50,000 jobs directly. Now there is going to be a new big mine opened, the Carmichael mine, run by the Indian company Adani, that's got the go-ahead. In that kind of context, with a project that you yourself, when you were in India as Australia's High Commissioner, said will drive economic growth and create more than 6,000 jobs in Australia, King coal is going to remain the master, really, isn't it, in all this? And however much there may be pressure from other countries and even some in Australia to reduce carbon emissions, the economic case is going to mitigate that.
I think Australia's signed up, as the whole world has, to the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is very clearly on a transition path to net zero emissions by the second half of this century, a much greater climate resilient world, and also to shifting finance flows to make sure that all of that happens. That's what Australia's signed up to and ratified. Many countries around the world have, but
building
by
a
the same
huge
token,
new mine and opening further mines to tap these reserves that have so far not been exploited, it's not going to make it any easier to make progress towards that target. If you're already falling short on the target, as your critics allege, and others are saying, why is Australia the only country, by the way, that's kind of engaging a bit of an accountancy fiddle, as they see, to take the credits from meeting its Kyoto targets and set them against this new target for the future? It's kind of not playing the rules of the game in the same way as everybody else. It's trying to claim it's doing stuff, but actually what it's doing is inadequate, and meanwhile it's happily generating more and more carbon emissions.
What I was going to say, by the same token, you cannot, it's unrealistic, as per the communique I was just talking about in the Pacific, to say that fossil fuels will be wished away or swept under the carpet tomorrow. You know, we had a very interesting briefing.
What about next year, next decade, 50 years, 100 years? It doesn't sound like that's the kind of direction in which Australia is going. Please.
But if I could just finish this point, you know, the head of the International Energy Agency briefed us at a ministerial last year, saying effectively 30 years ago, 80% of the world's energy mix was fossil fuels. 30 years of climate action, 80% still fossil fuels. We need to clean that up. If we don't clean up fossil fuels, then we're in crisis. Yes, we have to pull every lever we possibly can. That's renewables, that's nuclear for countries that have it. But fossil fuels will remain for some decades to come an integral part of the energy mix. We're all transitioning away from that, or we're looking for new technologies, better technologies to clean it up. But it's not going to happen overnight. So you can't wish away, from an Australian perspective, an entire coal industry overnight when 80% of the global energy mix is still using fossil fuels. That's A, unrealistic, and B, hypocritical to point the finger at Australia on something like that when the rest of the world, by and large, is still consuming vast amounts of fossil fuels. So Australia, like everyone else, has said we will transition out, we will look for better technologies, we will invest in cleaner technologies. One of the big success stories of some of the policies in Australia has been the financing mechanism that's driven $25 billion of clean energy into the Australian economy with closing down our own coal mines. So we, like many other countries, are doing our bit.
But building more.
Could Australia do more? Yes, of course we could. Prime Minister said he's prepared to have a look at it. From my perspective, I think Australia could do more. I've said that in some of the articles that I've recently written.
How much more? Okay, let's
many
be
other countries are in the same boat.
How much more do you think it should be doing? Because Laurence Tibiana, the former French Environment Minister, architect of the Paris Accord, told the Financial Times at the end of last year, basically Australia is cheating. And essentially, by taking the approach it is, by not really fulfilling its ambitious target and not going for a very ambitious one, that it's actually going to undermine the whole system. That in that sense, Australia is not a great exemplar, and its international reputation is being damaged by that.
Well, I'm not going to defend the government on the intended use of carryover, because what you're saying, I think, in that context is not in the spirit of the Paris Agreement, which was not to import lower levels of ambition, but to step up and have high levels of ambition in the Paris Agreement. But what I would say is, again, you've seen the Prime Minister and the government shift on this in recent weeks, where the Prime Minister has said the government intends to use carryover, to the extent necessary. And we won't know as Australia whether we need to use that carryover until 2032 when we true up our numbers. That's 12 years away. I'm absolutely confident that more policies will come through in the Australian context, more abatement will come out of the Australian economy, as it has been 50 million tonnes every year for the last couple of decades, and that carryover will not have to be used. The PM's already signalling that. So in a sense, I agree with what Laurence said, and I've worked very closely with her. I can understand her disappointment, but the Prime Minister, I think, from recent comments, is being more sensitive to that point.
Given finally, and briefly if you can, that we are at a stage of transition as you see it, where there is still new exploitation of carbon going on, but where there is now going to be hopefully an enforceable rule book, which all countries, perhaps excluding the United States for now, play a part in trying to mitigate the effects of climate change. Despite that, should Australians now expect that next year's fire season will be more of the same?
We're not going to change the global temperatures rise overnight or in the next decade or even a few decades. It's baked in. So in that sense, we've got to deal with climate change. And that's the tragic thing of what we're seeing around the world. It's not just Australia, it's not just fires, it's droughts, it's floods, it's all sorts of climate impacts, it's health impacts on different communities around the world. So that's why there is such an urgency around climate action, that this is not something that can be wished away or done away with one single shot, one bullet, 1 year, 1 decade. This is a transformation of the way we think about the world and the way we do business in the world and the way we interact with one another around the world. And it's a decade-long agenda. What I'm hopeful, what I see in Australia is the climate wars, I think, are lessening. I think the more extreme voices are being more muted, they're becoming shriller, but they're becoming more insignificant. My sense is that will continue. People understand climate is real. They're seeing the impacts now, they're feeling it, and when people see that, feel it, they know that, and they want things to be done. And I think the governments around the world are recognising that, and certainly the Australian government has and will. Yes, I do think the Australian government could be doing more on climate change, but they're signalling they will have another look, and I think that's very positive.
Patrick Suckling, Australia's former Ambassador for the Environment, thank you for being with us on Hard Talk.